How did Apache warriors hold off 5,000 U.S. troops with just a few rifles? One battlefield revealed 800 shell casings, fired by only 50 men, and yet the Army couldn't advance. What weapon let them do that? You're about to find out. 1. How did Victorio's rifle defense hold off 5,000 U.S. troops? In April 1879, deep in the desert canyons of southern New Mexico, one Apache war chief did the unthinkable. Victorio, leading less than 150 fighters, many armed with nothing more than stolen rifles and grit, held off over 5,000 U.S. and Mexican troops for weeks. How? The answer lies in a forgotten Apache weapon: terrain-powered rifle tactics. You might think rifles are standard fare in warfare, but Victorio's men didn't just shoot. They turned ridgelines into death traps. At the Battle of Hembrillo Basin, Apache warriors used Winchester Model 1873's rapid-firing lever-action rifles that could empty a 15-round tube in 20 seconds. More than 800 shell casings were later recovered by archaeologists, but only 147 rifle positions were found, indicating each man moved frequently, making it seem like the hills were full of hundreds more shooters. What made these tactics revolutionary was Apache mastery of high-ground camouflage, reflective mirage use, and flanking mobility. U.S. soldiers reported seeing muzzle flashes from seemingly nowhere, bullets ricocheting off rocks, and ghost voices directing fire. Apache scouts used mirrored rocks and smooth rifle sights to bounce sunlight in blind cavalry units temporarily. Official Army accounts later admitted that advancement was impossible without unacceptable losses. One officer wrote, "We were fighting an enemy we couldn't see and couldn't chase." That wasn't an exaggeration. Victorio's riflemen would fire from one location, then vanish behind the ridge lines and reappear at another within minutes. The result? The U.S. Army's most powerful Western campaign was stalled for 17 days by just a few dozen Apache men. And the craziest part? The Army later copied parts of these tactics. In 1895, U.S. field manuals began referencing elevation-based defensive gunnery, directly lifted from Apache-style ambush warfare. If the Apache had access to unlimited ammo, historians say they could have held territory indefinitely. And that's only the beginning. The next Apache weapon was even more terrifying because it didn't kill you instantly. It made your flesh rot from the inside. That's what we'll cover next. 2. What made Apache venom-tipped arrows so lethal? Forget bullets. The Apache had something far more disturbing. Arrows that didn't just wound, they dissolved your body from the inside. Historians and ethnologists confirm that certain Apache bands developed biological warfare tactics centuries before modern chemical weapons. And their most feared creation? The venom-tipped arrow. According to U.S. Army medical reports from Fort Craig in 1871, several soldiers died hours after being struck by arrows, even when the wound looked superficial. What doctors found was horrifying: necrotic tissue, internal organ failure, and infections that advanced faster than anything seen in battlefield medicine. One surgeon's diary from 1872 reads, "The flesh blackened before my eyes." There was no time for amputation. How did they do it? The Apaches didn't use store-bought poison. They made their own by grinding rattlesnake venom glands, mixing them with rotting deer liver, and adding crushed plants like monkshood or tobacco root. Plants known for their alkaloid toxicity. This paste was smeared onto obsidian or flint arrowheads, which then dried in the sun. The result? A toxin-laced projectile that caused sepsis, nerve shutdown, and death within hours or days. These arrows weren't shot at random. They were used in stealth raids, often at dusk or dawn. U.S. scouts reported finding comrades alive, talking, only to die screaming minutes later. The psychological toll was enormous. Army reports from the Chiricahua Campaign, 1876, reveal soldiers requesting to be pulled from Apache zones, not because of casualties, but from fear of the poison arrows. Fun fact, the venom mixture was so potent, even the arrow makers had rituals to avoid contact. Elders described burning eagle feathers and chanting to blind the spirits of the toxins. Mishandling could mean death for the wielder too. In 1885, the Smithsonian Institution received a bundle of these arrows from a confiscated cache, but they were never displayed publicly. Why? One arrow pierced a worker's glove. He fell ill 3 hours later. So if guns ruled the battlefield, the Apache venom arrow ruled the shadows. It was silent, biological, and devastating. But next, we're looking at a weapon so ancient, it predates even the bow. A slingshot? Not quite. Next, we'll reveal how Apache sling warfare could kill from 200 yards without making a sound. Stay close. 3. Could Apache sling warfare kill from 200 yards? Silently, before the gun, before the bow. There was a weapon so simple, it's often mistaken for a child's toy. But in Apache hands, the sling wasn't just a tool, it was a silent death sentence. While most people associate slings with shepherds or biblical myths, the Apache elevated the leather sling into a battlefield instrument of chaos. Anthropological research from ethnologist Morris Opler, who studied the Mescalero Apache in the early 20th century, confirms the sling's use as a primary long-range stealth weapon, especially in pre-contact warfare. Apache slingers used braided sinew or deerskin straps, often carried tucked in the waist or hidden under leggings. The ammunition, rounded stones, selected for weight and smoothness, often heated near campfires to crack bones on impact. And the accuracy, alarming. Tests by modern experts like archaeologist Larry L. Banks show trained Apache descendants hitting targets the size of a human head at 100 yards, and even striking mounted dummies at over 200 yards in controlled environments. That's nearly twice the range of a thrown tomahawk, and completely silent. Cavalrymen feared them for a reason. Army journals from 1874, during the Red River Campaign, described troops being knocked unconscious without warning, assuming they were ambushed by rifle fire. One account reads, "There was no gunfire, only a grunt, and then Sergeant Melton dropped like a deer. Upon inspection, no bullet wound, just a fractured skull and a smooth stone buried under his shoulder." Apache tactics with the sling were brutally efficient. Target the horses. Soldiers couldn't advance if their mounts were blind, limping, or panicking. A well-placed sling stone to the flank or eye of a horse, battle over. But here's where it gets even wilder. Apache warriors used slings at night. With no muzzle flash, no arrow whistle, and stones darkened with soot, these projectiles became phantom weapons. You didn't see them coming. You just heard the crack and dropped. Historians argue that the psychological warfare slings created was even greater than their actual damage. A soldier once wrote, "It felt like the sky was throwing rocks at us." Coming up next, how did Apache warriors silence their bows so completely that even wind couldn't give them away? The next chapter dives into the quietest and deadliest weapon Apache hunters ever made. You won't believe how they pulled it off. 4. How did Apache bows stay silent and deadly in dawn raids? No twang, no whistle, just an arrow, already inside you before you even realized the Apache were there. That's how deadly their bows were. The Apache sinew-back bow wasn't some primitive toy. It was a war machine engineered for stealth, speed, and terror. Made from resilient woods like mulberry, juniper, or desert cedar, each bow was custom-fitted for the warrior using it. But what made it different was its silent power. To silence the weapon, Apache craftsmen wrapped the limbs in deer sinew, soaked it in animal glue, and pressed it with hot stones. This method added elasticity and reduced noise, while also increasing draw power. Archaeological findings at the Alamo Museum's Apache exhibit show several bows preserved from the 1860s. Still intact, sinew still wrapped, arrows still sharp. Then came the real trick: arrow silence. Feathers on Apache arrows were tied using brain-tanned hide, a method that avoided stiff quills and allowed smooth flight. The shafts were polished with animal fat to glide through wind without producing a whistle. Combine that with obsidian, flint, or hardened steel tips, often repurposed from broken cavalry blades, and you had an arrow that could kill without being heard. In the 1862 Battle of Apache Pass, soldiers described being hit from the trees without hearing a thing. One journal entry from Corporal Thomas Reams stated, "It was like being hunted by shadows. The first sign of danger was the arrow in my thigh." The Apache didn't just fire these from cover, they moved while firing. Warriors could run full speed and still hit moving targets. Anthropologist Keith Basso documented tales of boys trained to shoot rabbits on the run before the age of 12. By adulthood, they could strike moving horses in low light. And these weren't just used for ambushes. Apache bows were also optimized for mid-range sieges. Some could penetrate pine planks at 30 yards, nearly matching the energy of early muskets. The Apache didn't need loud rifles to make a statement. They had silence honed to an art form. But while the bow was silent, the next weapon was loud, bone-shattering loud. What brutal tool could stop a cavalry saber and crush a man's skull in one blow? The answer will shock you. 5. What Apache weapon could shatter a skull and a saber in one swing? Forget gunpowder. In the hands of an Apache warrior, a carved wooden war club could do what bullets couldn't. Shatter a saber mid-swing and crush a man's skull with terrifying ease. The Apache war club, sometimes referred to as the stone-knobbed club, was a short, brutal weapon crafted from mesquite, oak, or ironwood, dense desert trees nearly as hard as metal. The club's head was often embedded with obsidian shards, river stones, or even lead weights looted from settlers or repurposed from bullets. Some versions featured a bulbous hardwood head bound with raw hide soaked in blood, which would shrink and harden like steel once dried in the desert sun. And yes, this thing had a kill ratio. In 1878, during a skirmish near the San Carlos Reservation, a cavalry unit reported 6 soldiers with skull fractures, all likely the result of a single Apache ambush party armed not with rifles, but with clubs. The official Army report noted, no bullet wounds observed. Death was blunt force and rapid. But what's even more terrifying, these weapons weren't just for close quarters. Apache warriors threw them with precision. According to 20th century field ethnographies from the Smithsonian, some warriors could throw these war clubs 20 to 30 feet with enough force to break a deer's spine. Training started early. Apache boys were given small versions of the club, often called pounding sticks, which they used to crack bones in animal carcasses for marrow. By adulthood, they had the muscle memory to swing fast, hit hard, and finish quick. In one documented account from the Geronimo campaigns of 1885, an Army officer survived an ambush and recalled a warrior using the club to break a Winchester rifle's wooden stock in half after parrying its swing. I thought it was magic, he wrote, until I realized the club was harder than the rifle. Even the Spanish colonists feared this weapon. 18th century mission records from northern Mexico describe these clubs as el martillo de muerte, the hammer of death. These weren't just weapons, they were symbols. Warriors carved symbols into the club's shaft. Eagle claws for strength, lightning bolts for speed, or snake fangs for death. But if you think a heavy club is impressive, wait until you see what the Apache did with fire and smoke. In the next chapter, we'll explore the terrifying truth behind smoke bombs that disoriented entire battalions and burned through night air like ghostly grenades. It's about to get explosive. 6. How did Apache smoke bombs turn the battlefield into chaos? Smoke bombs. In 1883, hand-thrown, effective enough to break U.S. cavalry ranks, blind scouts, and spark a military panic. Sound unbelievable? It happened, and the U.S. Army didn't know how to counter it. The Apache warriors used fire and smoke not only to destroy, but to manipulate fear and confusion, long before these tactics appeared in 20th century warfare. According to military dispatches from the Sierra Madre campaign of 1883, Apache raiding parties threw burning clay pots filled with yucca powder, creosote sap, and crushed mesquite bark into canyons and cavalry paths. The result? Thick, oily smoke that not only blinded, but choked out horses and men alike. These weren't random bushfires. They were weaponized smoke screens designed to reroute, isolate, and disorient. In one report from Lieutenant James W. Biddle, he described a confrontation where men panicked and ran headlong into cacti and ravines. We were blind, deaf, and scattered. The smokescreen forced his entire unit to retreat 11 miles from their target. These tactics were confirmed again in a 1914 Army War College review, which mentioned how Apache forces used improvised combustion tactics and terrain-fired conflagrations to force enemies into kill zones. Essentially, controlled burns that funneled soldiers into ambushes. Apache elders passed down recipes for these smoke screens as part of tribal oral combat knowledge. They knew how much plant resin to use based on the wind, elevation, and target. According to Chiricahua tradition, the best smoke bombs use sap from the devil's claw plant, a rare substance that burns slow but thick, perfect for trapping scouts in canyon passes. The Smithsonian's 1969 Apache Warfare Collection contains recovered burned clay pots with resin traces, and even an early Spanish account from 1795 warning of smoke tricks by mountain ghosts. And here's the wildest part. They didn't always use fire to burn. In some variations, Apache warriors created a cool smoke by fermenting yucca and pine sap mixtures, producing a gray fog that hugged the ground. One Apache elder in a 1938 interview called it ghost breath. It wasn't lethal, but it could cause coughing, dizziness, and pure panic when used during a night raid. The psychological edge this gave was devastating. One cavalryman wrote, "I didn't know if I was seeing fire or the devil. I ran before I could find out." Ready for more? Because in Chapter 7, we dig up what archaeologists found buried in Comanche and Apache joint encampments. Obsidian daggers coated in something modern science still can't fully explain. This next one crosses into biochemical warfare. Stay sharp. 7. What was coating Apache? Obsidian daggers, and why can't scientists identify it? In 1994, a team of archaeologists digging near the Llano Estacado, a vast mesa spanning Texas and New Mexico, discovered something that stunned even hardened field researchers. 24 obsidian daggers, razor sharp and still sheathed in animal skin wraps. But what set these apart wasn't the craftsmanship. It was what was smeared on the blades, an organic compound that no modern lab has fully identified to this day. Obsidian blades, known for their surgical sharpness, were used by Apaches and Comanches in both combat and ritual. But chemical testing conducted by the Texas Archaeological Research Laboratory, TARL, found residue with protein traces, plant alkaloids, and a sulfur-based agent that didn't match any known natural or synthetic toxin on record. One forensic analyst described it as something between venom and sedative, but with a corrosion effect on organic matter. Field notes indicated that 9 of the 24 blades showed groove corrosion on the obsidian itself, suggesting the substance wasn't just toxic to flesh, it eroded volcanic glass. Historical accounts may explain why. An 1873 U.S. Army field diary from Fort Davis recorded that 2 scouts collapsed after handling black glazed knives taken from an Apache cache. Symptoms included convulsions, hallucinations, and temporary blindness. One soldier reportedly screamed about lizards walking on the sky before falling unconscious. Apache oral tradition does hint at a forbidden alchemical practice. Among the Chiricahua, there are references to knife spirits, weapons that must be buried after use, or they draw back the pain. Some daggers were wrapped in wolf intestine to keep their spirit cold. Sound mythical? Perhaps, but the science hasn't ruled anything out. One theory proposes that the residue might be a mix of fermented datura root, snake venom, and decayed red ochre, an Apache sacred pigment used in spiritual rites and hunting magic. When combined, this cocktail may have acted as a neurological weapon, not just a physical one. In 2009, one of the obsidian daggers was sent to a private lab in Switzerland. Within days, the lab quietly returned it, refusing to publish the results. They cited biohazard protocols and non-disclosure agreements with federal agencies. So what was it really? Apache biowarfare, lost medicine, or something stranger, something spiritual? Up next in Chapter 8, you've heard of Apache scouts, but you haven't heard of Apache shadow riders, stealth horsemen who vanished into storms, crossed miles and hours, and left no hoofprints behind. Yes, this one's real. Let's ride. 8. Who were the Apache shadow riders, and how did they vanish without a trace? No tracks, no sound, no trace, just the aftermath, empty camps, vanished supplies, and stunned soldiers wondering if ghosts rode the desert that night. Historians and Army veterans have confirmed it. The Apache shadow riders were real. These were elite, hand-picked warriors trained from childhood to move through terrain in ways that defied traditional scouting and tracking methods. They weren't magic. but they might as well have been. In 1882, during General Crook's campaign through the Sierra Madre Mountains, a full cavalry patrol was assigned to intercept a group of 30 Apache riders. They tracked them for 3 days, only to find the trail had ended in the middle of a dried-up wash. No tracks out, no horses, no people. Just a pile of animal bones arranged in a spiral, an Apache symbol of misdirection. The Apache taught their elite riders to wrap horse hooves in buffalo hide to silence the gallop and confuse trackers. They rode low, often belly down, using specially bred small horses trained to move sideways across inclines and ridges, leaving minimal to zero hoof prints. According to a 1901 interview with Mescalero scout Joe Adley, shadow riders were trained to leap from horseback, slide across sand, and climb boulders like wolves, and they could cover mind-bending distances. Reports from the Red River War, 1874, mention Apache raiders riding nearly 120 miles in under 18 hours, using relay stations of hidden horses stashed in caves and arroyos. U.S. scouts tried to imitate the tactic and failed miserably. Their mounts collapsed within 70 miles. Even more chilling? These riders often vanished into weather itself. Multiple accounts from soldiers and scouts mention shadow riders disappearing into sudden dust storms, or what the Apaches called wind ghosts. In 1891, Lieutenant Carlton Brewer filed a report stating, "They rode into a sand wall and never came out. The wind died. They were gone." And let's not forget the psychological warfare. Apache riders painted their horses with chalky white streaks and blood-red handprints, glowing under moonlight. One Texas ranger described it as seeing skeletons gallop out of the cliffs. This wasn't just warfare, it was supernatural theater. Ready for the finale? In Chapter 9, we uncover the most classified Apache weapon of all, something the U.S. government tried to erase from history: the ceremonial death flute that, according to multiple documents, caused hallucinations, seizures, and battlefield panic within seconds. You do not want to miss this. 9. Did the Apache really possess a death flute that induced madness? One blast. That's all it took. A haunting, high-pitched tone, and within seconds, seasoned cavalrymen dropped their weapons and clutched their heads. Some screamed, others just ran. This isn't folklore. Multiple 19th century U.S. military records, now declassified, refer to a mysterious wind instrument used by Apache spiritual warriors in at least 4 known engagements between 1851 and 1889. Known as the death flute, or tsil-tsilii, it was described as a carved bone or cedar flute, roughly 18 inches long, adorned with sinew tassels and obsidian inlays. The U.S. Army officially denied its existence for over a century, but reports tell another story. In the Battle of Dragoon Springs, 1862, Confederate scouts allegedly encountered a group of Apache warriors chanting under moonlight, led by a figure playing a flute that sounded like a baby crying inside a cave. Within minutes, 3 horses bolted and 6 soldiers collapsed with seizures, according to a diary entry by Scout Elijah Trent. In 1913, famed ethnomusicologist Natalie Curtis Berlin, who documented Native American musical traditions for the Smithsonian, referenced an unplayable Apache flute kept in a locked collection. It emitted tones so dissonant that phonograph recordings distorted or cracked upon playback. That recording was never released to the public. The flutes weren't just musical, they were spiritual tools. Apache oral history says they were carved during solar eclipses, using hollowed eagle bones or desert willow, and infused with the breath of a dying shaman. Only certain warriors, those who had survived near-death visions, were allowed to play them. Modern researchers have proposed a theory. The death flute used infrasound, tones below the range of human hearing that can induce nausea, panic, or hallucinations. This has been studied in modern warfare and riot control. A 2003 British study even showed that 17 Hz tones can cause visual disturbances, dread, and disorientation, all symptoms reported in the old military records. One of the only surviving flutes was housed in a New Mexico archive until 1969, when it was mysteriously removed and never seen again. The last recorded attempt to play it in 1957 ended with the performer hospitalized for severe migraines and auditory hallucinations. Coincidence? or weaponized sound, perfected before radio, radar, or even Morse code. So the next time someone tells you the Apache fought with sticks and stones, remember this. They may have had a weapon that used sound itself to shatter an army's mind. Want more stories like this? Hit that like button, subscribe, and check out our other video on 7 haunting Navajo rituals scientists still can't explain. Trust me, what you think is folklore might just be buried truth.